edition of Jan's opening clinic. Well, normally I like to answer user questions in this series. This time around I'm going to do something different. I'm going to recap all the games from the tournament I recently played in, the Bangkok Open 2016. And I'm going to take you through my worries and troubles in the opening, my preparation, what went well, what didn't go well. Did the same thing last year, but since this is pretty much the only tournament I play nowadays, the Bangkok Open, we had to wait a year for a new edition. Spoiler alert, I did not win the tournament again. I won the first time I played in 2011, haven't won since, which is annoying, but what are you gonna do? Let's jump right into it and start with round number one, surprisingly, where... Hang on, I gotta set this up properly. Here we go. Round number one, open tournament. I faced Finn Nor, an old friend from Denmark, rated 2014, which, as we can see by my rating, significantly lower than mine, but still, first round, you always gotta be a little careful, especially with the black pieces. These games aren't so easy. It's an open tournament, so it's quite common that you don't really know your opponent. You don't know who's gonna arrive, who's not gonna arrive. So there's normally the pairings are coming out very late, and I was totally unprepared for this game. When I walked to the playing hall, I saw whom I was playing, which is not ideal, but the 600 extra rating points should compensate for that fact normally. He went e4 and I4. I'm not sure what the reason is. I went for c5, mainly because the line I played was fresh in my mind. Knight f3, d6. I do this sometimes. e4, e5 is my main line, but against weaker players. I like to play the Sicilian, but normally if I do, I'm gonna play the knight or the dragon. But I had just finished doing commentary on the candidates, and especially the last round was still very fresh in my mind, where Fabiano Caruana, in a must-win situation, played this, what do we call it, classical or Richter rouser or whatever, knight c6 line against Kayakin. And I was doing commentary with Robin van Kampen, who knew quite a bit about this line, and he explained it on the air. So I thought I might as well try it, see how Finn Nor reacts. And he did react with the main line, bishop g5, e6, queen to d2. Bishop g5 is really the only critical move, and then intending to go long castles as quickly as possible. The fashionable line is this move a6. There are other lines, bishop e7 and whatnot, but a6, this is what Caruana did, and pretty much the only line I knew here. Barely long castles and bishop to d7, so you can recapture on c6 with the bishop. Here, the Caruana game went f4, h6, bishop h4 and b5. And that line I knew, well, not in detail really, no Grandmaster League preparation, but I knew the basics after having covered that game. And I thought it was a fresh and complicated position, so I was very willing to play it. But Finn played the move king to b1, very natural move in any Sicilian. Looks a little slow though, which put me out of book. I reacted with b5, which looks fairly natural, hinting at b4 and knight takes e4 ideas. So he went f3. And here, my problem was I had the feeling that the best move is bishop to e7, which I still think it is, but I didn't really want to do it because white has the option of going for something like this, takes, and queen takes d6. And such an endgame is not scary for black at all. With the two bishops, and especially this powerhouse, he does a full compensation, but still not the kind of scenario you want in the first round against a weaker opponent. I thought this would be quite tough to win, so I decided not to do it, and instead of bishop e7, I played a slightly strange move, the move rook c8, which is useful, but in some lines it's not so useful. So I wasn't sure about this, but I felt it left more fight on the board. Finn surprised me. The normal move to my mind would be something like either bishop back to e3, intending to play g4, or the immediate g4, which I was going to meet with h5, kind of typical move in these structures. If white is not ready to go g5, you bother them on the king side, when at least I thought the position was quite weird. But he sacrificed on b5, bishop takes b5, a takes b, knight takes b5. Not an unknown idea, but here it doesn't even come with tempo. White still gets 3 pawns for his piece, but overall I don't think this is life-threatening. And in the game, I reacted sort of okay. There's a bunch of moves that make sense here. Knight e5 is alright, but what I played was also okay. h6, bishop takes, I took with a pawn. Knight takes d6, bishop d6, queen d6, knight e5. And here, all the black pieces are active, while white has the 3 passed pawns. They're a long way from queening, so I would guess the position is roughly equal, maybe slightly better for black. I managed to win it, even though it has to be said, after a lot of adventures. I won this endgame, which I didn't play particularly well, and it wasn't smooth sailing in the first round, but opening-wise, after king e7, which I played here, black certainly didn't experience any problems. That I didn't play this endgame particularly well is a different story. But these 600 extra rating points gotta be worth something, so I did win my first round game. Moving on to the second round. Which was my second round game? I think it was this one against Wong Yin Long from Singapore or Malaysia. I'm sorry, I should know such stuff, but I don't know. What I do know is that he's a very talented teenager. This game I could prepare for, but as it often happens with when you're playing teenagers, my database had like a couple games from 2014, which for a, I don't know how old he is, maybe 15, is an eternity, and back then he played the King's Indian. So after d4, knight f6, I went knight f3, he played e6. I was already unsure what to do, but c4, I'm pretty well versed in most main lines. I wasn't that scared yet. After c4, he played bishop b4 check, the Bogo Indian, decent opening, and in my opinion the most critical move is the move knight bd2. You could make a case for bishop d2 as well, of course, but I generally like trying to get the 2 bishops, and you have a better chance after knight bd2. Here the critical line, in my opinion, is short castles a3, bishop e7, e4, d5, which can lead to very sharp play. There's some discussions at the highest level of this stuff. e5, knight ft7, bishop d3, c5. And it's a mess, but it's supposed to be pretty dangerous for black after queen c2. Black has to weaken his kingside. And this is where the theoretical discussions are held after h6. I wasn't expecting this, so I wouldn't say I was booked up here, but I was willing to go into this. But he played a calmer line, slightly calmer, the move b6 here. b6 signals that black is willing to give up this bishop and then, try to control the center with pieces. I believe this is better for white, because if you compare it to a line in the Nimzo, which I also play a lot, something like this. White has basically won a tempo, because in this line the queen had to move twice to get to c3, while in our game it will only have to move once to get to d2. And it's not really better placed on c3 than d2. It normally ends up going to c2 anyway. So I always thought this was a pleasant line to play for white. Bishop b7, e3 short castles, bishop e2. White just develops with his 2 bishops. d6 castles, knight bd7, b4. All of this is standard stuff. Here the main plan for black is to go knight to e4, queen to c2 and f5 and try to manufacture a kingside attack. Rook f6 followed by rook g6 or rook h6, which is why this line is popular. Not so much at the very highest level, because I think there people value the 2 bishops more highly than black's attacking chances, but this is quite easy to play for black, and it's not so easy for white how to react. I believe the theoretical discussions are focused around either d5 immediately, e5 knight d2, and white is going to claim he's slightly better, once again because of the bishops, or some lines with bishop b2, rook f6, and now d5, rook to g6. With a messy position. However, I like white's chances in both of these lines, so I wasn't that concerned. He played queen e7, which is fine. This signals that black wants to play more slowly. But after bishop b2, knight e4, queen c2, now f5, you could argue that queen to e7 is a bit of a loss of a tempo, especially if black wants to go for sharper lines. I went rook fd1. You could also make a case for d5 immediately. But rook fd1 looked alright as well, to prepare d5 should I need it. And in the game a5 was played, which doesn't really seem to the point to me, because black has no interest in doing battle on the queen side. After a5, d5, e5, knight to d2, I got a pretty stable advantage with the 2 bishops. And as I said, a5 I believe is not helping the black cause here. And I won that game, more or less convincingly, which once again, since I did outrate my opponent by quite a bit, is nothing to brag about too much. If you want to study that line with black, I would recommend going for the sharper stuff with short castle. And yeah, for white, this is a position where you don't really have to know that much. If you want to study something, it's this position here, d5 or bishop b2. But that's the extent of my knowledge, and it tends to be sufficient in such lines. So 2 out of 2, but to weaker opponents, no big deal. And then in the third round, I faced another teenager, and as you can see, I did not manage to win that one against Arjun Kalyan, I believe from India, but I'm bad with nationalities. No, I'm pretty sure he was from India. Third round, the problem in this one is it's a double round. They have one double round, which we're trying to convince the organizers to get rid of in the Bangkok Open. Round 2 and 3, so you play your first game at 9 in the morning and the second game at like 3, which meant I didn't have a lot of time to prepare. And I did check my database, but there were once again very, very few games from my opponent. It's a problem when playing kids, very hard to prepare for, so I didn't really know what to expect. He went e4, I went e5 this time around. Had I had more information, I might have gone c5, but nothing wrong with e5, this is my main weapon. We got to this position, which is standard stuff. I've done a bunch of video series and so on about the marshal, but I still wasn't sure if I wanted to go for the marshal. In his previous games, I believe he had preferred bishop c4, so I really was not ready for anything in particular here. So I made sort of a live read. He spent some time and then he played c3, and to me I might be wrong, but that time might be like, oh, he could go marshal. Not sure what to do about it. I didn't have the feeling he was prepared for the game. So I went for the marshal, which is double-edged as a choice because against a much weaker opponent, at least on paper, there are some forcing lines where it's going to be hard for black to create winning chances. But I thought, and rightly so, first of all I had the feeling he wouldn't know very much, and secondly, I know quite a bit and I can steer the game into some lines where it's not so easy for white to make a draw. So he blitzed out some moves, but it didn't look so convincing. He went for this d4. Nowadays the main theoretical battleground is d3. For details, check my video series. But he went d4, which of course is fine, the old mainline. Bishop d6, rook e1, queen h4. Marshal, standard stuff. Black is a pawn down, but gets some nice initiative on the queen side, on the king side, sorry. g3, queen h3. And here he surprised me, but once again I had the feeling he didn't really know this stuff, but was making it up over the board by playing bishop takes d5. Normally this is structurally it's a mistake. As a marshal player you should always be happy to see that, because after cd you are still a pawn down, but these 3 pawns tend to hold the white 4 pawns quite convincingly, and black now does have the 2 bishops, so there is always long-term compensation. It can be hard to win these positions if you don't get an initiative. And of course it's a theoretical move. I wasn't out of book here, so is queen to f3. And I did recall, not a lot, but I did recall that in this line you're supposed to go bishop f5, not bishop to g4. Because then after queen takes d5, things aren't so easy. Well, bishop f5 threatens bishop e4, and it's very, very useful in lines with queen takes d5. Black goes rook to e8. And here, let's make some collaborative moves. Rook takes e8, rook takes e8, bishop e3. Black already wins with bishop e4, intending queen g2 checkmate. So yeah, that was pretty much the extent of my knowledge about this line. Queen takes d5 is still the best move, and after rook a8, bishop d2. But black is fine here in various ways. One of them, the move bishop d3, when yeah, there's nothing for white. But instead my opponent, after some thought, played the move knight d2, stopping the threat of bishop e4, but also locking in his own queenside. And black should be very fine here. I went rook a8 when white already has to find absolutely the only move to stay in the game with rook to e3. And in this position I had a very serious miscalculation, let's say, and played a pretty terrible move, which shouldn't happen. I could come up with the usual double round excuses, but yeah, really it shouldn't happen. I went rook e6, which I thought was clever, but is fairly ridiculous. Black has won the opening battle here. What I should do is just take on e3. When after f takes e3, rook to e8, black has more than enough compensation. h5, h4 as a plan. The white pieces are clumsy, the light squares are weak. I think I was calculating something like this, and I wasn't sure how good it is, but it is very, very unpleasant for white such a position because, yeah, my light square compensation is just too strong, and there's always going to be trouble on this long diagonal. So rook takes e3 was the way to go. After queen takes e3, even bishop d7, intending rook e8. This is a dream position for a martial player. But long story short, I went rook e6, which I thought was very clever, because after queen takes d5, which unfortunately he played, my brilliant idea was to go rook fe8, just maintaining the pressure, you know. And if rook takes e6, rook takes e6, I thought I was more or less winning, threatening rook e1 check, which is correct, but unfortunately I missed a little detail here, which is the move queen takes d6, after which I could resign because rook takes d6, rook takes e8 happens to be checkmate. So I did spot that in time, pretty much as usual, after I made the move rook e6, that the chances to win that game had pretty much passed, and here I was kind of lucky that I could still bail out. I had seen this in my defense, but obviously it wasn't what I had intended. It's a typical martialish trick. I go bishop takes g3, h takes g, rook e3, this is the game, queen g3, queen g2, queen e3. And it turns out that black is so active that white can't avoid a perpetual. Not that my opponent really seemed all that interested in avoiding it. The game ended with queen f2, queen g5, queen g2, queen e3. But it's very hard for white to get out of this. For example, if he plays king h2 here, queen h6, king g3, which looks like a winning attempt. I don't have a perpetual, but black just goes rook e8. And the black initiative is very, very powerful here. Let's say knight f3, queen g6 check, king h2, queen h5 check. And white is really playing with fire, so not surprised. My opponent didn't go for this, but instead went for the perpetual, which of course, being 300 points or whatever high rated, was not my dream scenario. But such things can happen in an open with black, especially in a double round. So next game was against, I believe, my countryman Silvio Lahtela, also active on Chess24, 2278. So once again, I'm serious rating favorite. And after d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, this one I wasn't surprised about. I had checked his games, both his games in the database and his games on Chess24. So I was actually quite familiar with his repertoire, and he had clearly studied Robin van Kempen's very good series on the King's Indian. So I thought, let's take him out of book early. I didn't want to have a theoretical debate with Robin. And I went for a line which I sometimes play, the move 3 knight bd2, which is not as dumb as it looks, but it is still reasonably dumb. The point is, if black goes bishop g7, as King's Indian players would like to, then white goes e4, intending bishop d3, short castle, c3, and you get more of a Peert's position, which of course is not winning for white, but it's playable, and most King's Indian players are less happy in such a situation. Therefore, most guys play d5, as Silvio did in this game. I believe c5, d takes c, queen to a5 is also a very, very decent line for black. So he played d5, I went e3, bishop to g7. Here the point of white's setup is you go b4, stop black from going c5, and then you want to develop your pieces quietly, bishop b2, c4, bishop e2. And I actually do think that there's some chances for an opening advantage here. It looks goofy, but it's not that dumb. However, after short castles, I made a mistake, a prepared mistake, but still a mistake. I was being cute, and I started with the move bishop e2 here. As I just mentioned, white wants to go bishop b2, bishop e2, and c4 in one order or another. And I sort of outsmarted myself by getting worried about some lines after bishop b2, which is the most obvious move, a5, b5, a4. When with this bishop already moved, it's less attractive to put it on a3, which you probably should still do to stop this pawn. So bishop e2 is hoping for the same reaction when after a5, b5, a4, you go bishop a3 and you win a whole tempo. But of course bishop e2 has other drawbacks, and one big one was exploited by Silvio, who played the move knight to e4 here, which is a very good move and I think equalizes. It's threatening knight to c3, and if I take it, takes, knight d2, e5, I couldn't see anything that I liked for white, so I rejected that. Instead I went bishop to b2. But now black gets to exchange a bit of material, and it's already very hard to pretend to play for an opening advantage here. If knight takes, then the problem is queen to d6, attacking this pawn, let's say a3, and e5, and I couldn't really see any problems for black. So I decided against that and played queen takes, but the queen is a little awkward on d2 with the remaining pieces, and Silvio reacted very well once again, went bishop g4, potentially getting rid of this passive bishop. I played c4, c6. Here it's already sort of tricky to come up with a move. If I go short castles, then d takes c4 bothered me, because after bishop c4, bishop f3, gf, black could even go e5. So it wasn't really to my liking. Not sure if e5 is good, by the way, but this position in general, even after knight d7, I wasn't that excited about. And it's tough to make a move. I thought I played a decent move, queen to c2, preparing for dc4 so I can take with the queen here. But you can't pretend to have an opening advantage here at all. Silvio played knight d7, short castles, and he simplified the position here, which you don't have to do. a5 is fine, or any move is fine really. Went for something forcing with the move e5, which I think is a mistake. If you want to do this, you should probably take and then go e5, when the position, once again, is very close to equal. Instead, in the game after e5, well, this isn't really the opening part anymore. His point was, after this more or less forced sequence, that queen e7 wins a pawn back, but now white gets an extra move, and I had a pleasant choice between f4 and what I played, b5, bishop e5, takes, bc, bc, which objectively should be a draw, but white is a little better because of these weaknesses, and I managed to somehow grind out a point, even though far from a brilliant game. And yeah, opening-wise, I don't think this line is terrible, but you should really start with bishop b2, or with c4 here, not with bishop e2. Then, next game, against a player I was quite concerned about when I saw the pairings. The rating doesn't look very impressive, Hoang Son Dang from Vietnam, but some guys told me that he has a huge reputation in Southeast Asia, winning every tournament. I know guys from Vietnam are often underrated and very, very tricky. And this guy had defeated Nigel Short just a couple rounds ago, so I was very much warned. And I wasn't sure what to play. I also wasn't sure what he was gonna play because the database didn't give me a lot of info. In the end, it turned out to be a Catalan, and here it's, once again, the line I'm most comfortable with is the one I played, bishop e7. I know this one best. It's part of my repertoire video series here on Chess24. But against a weaker opponent, it's always tempting to do something else, dc4 or bishop b4 check. But since I hadn't really expected the Catalan, I decided to go with what I know best. And I got lucky. This is all mainline theory. Queen c2, a6 for details. Check out my video series, queen takes c4 or a4. Dang win with a4, bishop d7, queen c4, bishop c6. And while I think black's position is fine, white's position here is incredibly solid with his extra pawn in the center. And after both bishop f4 and bishop to g5, it's not easy at all for black to, win the game, let's put it that way. So I wasn't sure if I was happy with the way the opening went, even though objectively I think it's fine. But once again, if the rating difference is 300 points, then some other factors than it's objectively equal come into play. But here my opponent made me very happy by going knight c3, which is really the only serious mistake you can make in this line, because it allows a little trick. It allows the move b5, which is a lot more powerful with the knight on c3. After ab, the problem is that ab picks up the rook on a1 with a double attack, so you can't take. Queen has to go, and now b4 wins a lot of tempi for black. The knight has to go away, knight b1, bishop e4, queen e3, c5. And here black really is many tempi up compared to normal lines, so this is already a dream scenario. And Dang made matters worse by going rook d1 here, which is a pretty terrible move, and I'm not sure why he did it. He probably was slightly upset about the way the opening had gone. If you play knight bd2 or whatnot, bishop d5, dc5, black is very comfortable, you get this pawn back, but he's not much better or anything. While rook d1 is a really bad move because he's self-pinning himself, whatever. But after knight c6, black's position is already more or less winning with the pressure on the d4 pawn, which can't move. My opponent couldn't find anything better than queen to d2, which goes to show how bad his position already is. And here there's many ways to roam. C takes d4 looked good, queen b6 looked good. I decided to go for a forced sequence with knight a5, which is also good enough, winning in exchange. And yeah, the rest I didn't convert perfectly, but clearly the opening has gone terribly wrong for white, and black is more or less winning here. And I did manage to win that game in the end, which I was quite happy about, because as I said, yeah, this I thought was a tough opponent whose rating was not reflecting his true strength. In general, the Bangkok Open, in case you're wondering why am I playing 2300 players all the time, is a very strong tournament. There's many Grandmasters. Paco Vallejo was playing, Ganguly, Nigel Short, Luke Van Vele, Benjamin Bock, Ilda Khairulin, and so on and so forth. Sure, I'm forgetting some. But I had the feeling I was always getting the underrated kit. Sometimes that's a function of the Swiss system. I believe I was like the 5 seed, so quite often I was still in the first half of the pairings, but I was getting the lowest rated on the second half, because it was barely in the first half. And yeah, was a lot of low rated guys, which can be good or can be bad if they're really good. But what are you gonna do? You just play whom you're supposed to play next round. And the trend continued, because I got yet another teenager called Xingyang Nie, I think 16-year-old Chinese guy rated 22-27, which is also scary, because you don't know with the Chinese guys, if they haven't played a lot abroad, he could be Grandmaster strength, or he could be 22-27 strength. He had defeated, I believe, Smirnov and Gerhard Schiebler earlier in the tournament. So I was warned, but I was white. My opponent was much lower rated, so of course I should win that game. Once again, the database didn't help all that much. I should be talking more about preparation, but there wasn't that much to prepare, because most of my opponents, yeah, there wasn't a lot of info, and they changed their repertoire recently. However, I had seen that he had a bit of a tendency to not be very theoretical, to go for this setup, the semi-Slav, which of course is fine, but then to avoid any critical lines. In general, just try to play chess. Therefore, I played the move after which I believe you shouldn't just try to play chess, but you should go for a critical line with dc4 and b5, the Maran. While if white plays the other trendy move, which we're gonna see in a second, the move queen c2, then bishop d6 is very playable, in fact the main line. So I went bishop d3, expecting that he wouldn't be ready for a theory debate in the Maran, which is very complicated and where I know my way quite well. And I was right, he played bishop d6, which in this position, it's not a mistake, but it gives white the initiative, because white can immediately push in the center with e4 takes, knight takes, bishop takes. And this position is much easier to play for white. You castle, you go bishop c2, queen d3, get the bishop out, and I think it's seriously unpleasant, so I was quite happy reaching this. After castles, I have some experience for some reason. I've played this position quite a bit. The main move here is h6. The point being that you want to go e5 with black, but if you go e5 immediately, then white has a choice to win a pawn. Even though this position is still work, you're a pawn up, which is a good start. Therefore, they play h6 to prepare e5. Here, after h6, bishop c2, e5. I've had some games. I've played rook e1 here. I've played queen d3 here, both of which I believe lead to a white opening advantage. Instead, my opponent surprised me by playing the move queen to c7. This put me out of book, but it's a good out of book, because I saw that my position was pleasant and that I had some nice choices. Bishop c2 is once again very possible, just preparing the standard plan of going queen d3, which is hard to meet for black. For example, let's say c5, queen d3, and black already has to make some awkward moves, f5 or g6, because knight f6, bishop g5 tends to be very, very bad news. But I had another pleasant choice here, which I went for, which I think is a good move as well. Move c4, c5. This might look a little anti-positional at first sight, because I'm weakening the d5 square. But the big thing is, if I can stop him from going e5, which I can, then this bishop on c8 will remain buried for most of the game. And here, things have already gone quite wrong for black. He played bishop f4, bishop e7 is no better. Rook e1, just against e5. Rook d8 and b4, defending c5. Knight to f8, black is doomed to passive maneuvering. Here I took a weird decision, that's why I keep showing you the game, which probably isn't best objectively, and Lukey boy, Luke Van Vele, made a bit of fun of me for doing it, but I thought it made some sense at least. I played the move bishop to b2, which looks ridiculous because on paper this is my bad bishop and this is his good bishop, so I should really exchange those and not keep them on the board. But that's why chess is so tricky. That's also the logic that, well, I have more space and I want to keep pieces on the board, not exchange them. And I was fantasizing about some lines where, I don't know, something good could happen to me on this long diagonal. I don't think bishop b2 is objectively a great move. In fact, if you had this position and someone played bishop b2 to c1, maybe you would praise them for their deep understanding. But it does not spoil white's advantage here either. And I won that game more or less without big problems, even though I missed a tactic later that annoyed me because I spent a lot of time thinking about it. I'll show you the position. My opponent played knight to d7, which is a bad move. Knight takes g5, knight takes c5. That was his point. Knight f7, king f7. And here, I had the feeling that to be a forced win, or even when I calculated knight f7, but somehow the right move didn't cross my mind, which is a bit embarrassing. I was thinking about all kinds of tricks with queen f4, intending queen takes f5 check, but they don't really work, mainly because queen f4 doesn't threaten all that much, apart from queen f5. And in the end I settled on dc5, which is much better for white, but not winning directly. Black still collapses around here. But long story short, I was very annoyed that afterwards I didn't see the move rook a5, which wins the game on the spot, because I was thinking about taking with something on f5. Just didn't cross my mind that the rook could get there. Knight e4, rook takes f5, and it resigns. Still didn't spoil the game, but it was a little silly not to see that. Anyway, because of my pretty good pairings, or my excellent play, I was at, where was I at? 5.5 out of 6 at this point, which is pretty good, and I was the sole leader together with our friend Luke Van Vele, which meant we faced each other, and in a way I was lucky to repeat the white pieces, because Luke, as the highest seed, had also had white in the last round, which meant he was changing colors, not me. But I was gonna get absolutely nothing in that game. Luke plays all kinds of things. He plays the Grunfeld quite a bit, he plays the King's Indian quite a bit. He had played the King's Indian against me in our last game, and he's also a Grunfeld specialist, so I wasn't really sure what to expect. He did go for another line he plays regularly, the Semi-Slav, but it was somehow low on my list, and I hadn't prepared anything in particular. I went e3 again, and after knight bd7, I thought I've played bishop d3 the day before. I should probably change, he's booked up on that. And I went for the other move, which I play regularly, the move queen c2. So it's not like I was making up stuff here. I do have a repertoire and all that after queen c2. But after bishop d6, bishop d3, castles, castles, which is a position where I think both Luke and me have a lot of experience in. And we're gonna see a version of this position later on in the tournament. I, for some reason, was 100% sure that he was gonna go for the line with d takes c4, bishop c4 and b5. Where we're gonna see later, my preparation is also not great, but at least I had some ideas. But Luke played another move here, which has been gaining popularity, and I was aware of the move, but I just didn't think he would play it. The move e6, e5. In fact, since this is apparently a very strong equalizing weapon, a lot of guys have started in this position after bishop d6 to go bishop e2, castles, and now castles. We've seen this in Kayaking Giri recently. I believe Giri himself against Grandelius did something similar. So people are really going out of the way to avoid this e5, because with the bishop on e2 it's less good. You whatever can take and play an isolated queen's pawn position where the bishop is much better placed on e2 than on d3. But long story short, Luke surprised me with his e5. I played the main line cd, cd, e4, e takes d, knight takes d5, ed, h6. All of this has been played at the highest level. Recently, Giri's had some good games here. And I went for a line where I'd seen one recent game where Vishy Anand very surprisingly lost to Benjamin Gledura from Hungary. But it turns out this line is absolutely nothing. And frankly, when I saw his position on the board, I was aware that it is supposed to be very little and that I probably won't win the game with knight takes d4. But I wasn't booked up enough in the alternatives here. Like moves like rook d1 or b3 probably lead to a more complicated fight. But the line I played, knight takes d4, is just drawish. And yeah, honestly, I knew that. I thought maybe there's some hope since Vishy lost that ending, but not really. All of this is theory. The moves might look spectacular or whatnot, but there have been many games, including high-level battles between MVL and Giri. I believe 2 of those even. So I kind of knew there's not a lot to get here. Black wins back this d5 pawn with some precise play, and the position simplifies too much. All of this is still this game, Gledura against Anand. I'm not quite sure where I deviated. Maybe here I played g3. I think that game was a3. But this endgame white has a mild initiative. That's really nothing. So yeah, can't complain too much. Luke is a great player, and a draw of course is not terrible, but with white you wanna put a little pressure, and I really did manage. Luke was precise here as well. I believe the game Vishy lost, Vishy did some strange things, like he went h5, allowed bishop g5, and then he exchanged the rooks. And then you can get into trouble because the white king becomes a lot more active. And yeah, this is not exactly Vishy's game, but it was something along those lines. If you can get something like this, or sorry, let's say this, king e4, and get the king to d5, then you're better. But black is under no obligation to allow all this. And then the game after king f8 was a draw after some insignificant moves. So yeah, what to do? In general, be better prepared for this move e5, which I hadn't expected. But I've looked a bit afterwards. I think it's pretty tough for white to come up with anything here. So I'm not that surprised that fashion is shifting towards bishop e2 in this position. And that's might be a place where I'm going to have to look in the future. The next game, another very tough opponent. I was at 6 out of 7, still in shared lead. Half a point ahead of my next round opponent, Ildar Khairulin. Oh, I have a Luke picture. I should actually show the Luke picture to add some pictures. Here we have Lukey Boy sitting in a sky bar in Bangkok, wearing his Champions Are Made in the off-season t-shirt, which I'm not sure is accurate. But yeah, next game, round number 8. Black against Ildar Khairulin from Russia. Very strong player. I actually think he's a little underrated, but I'm mainly saying that because he beat me 2-6, 29. And for this game, I made a very serious mistake. I decided to prepare seriously, not leave the hotel. Normally I would go for a massage after the game, then get dinner. And that game we had, I believe, a sponsors dinner in the hotel, which was fantastic, very nice invitation. And after that I decided, you know what, I'll prepare. This guy is a d4 player mainly, so I'm gonna work on my d4 repertoire. Spent quite a bit of time preparing for the lines I was expecting after 1 d4. But then he played e4, which I had barely looked at all. He's a flexible guy. He can play both e4 and d4, but there were a lot more games with d4, 1 d4 or 1 knight f3. And I maybe wrongly think that my e4 repertoire is sort of better than my d4 repertoire, so I was less worried about it. But The problem is I'm very predictable here. Against a strong guy, I'm not going to play the Sicilian normally, so I'm going to stick to my stuff. I sometimes play the Berlin, but very rarely. And most of the time I do play the Marshall, as this time. And it didn't go well, and I'm still upset at myself for this. He played the move 6d3, which is not a surprise. This move is as fashionable as Rook e1. Peter Svidler has done a whole video series about the move 6d3 for Chess 24, and Svidler had also faced it recently in the candidates in a game against Caruana after b5, bishop b3, d6. The trendy move here is the move a3, just playing it slowly, intending to go knight c3, and keeping this bishop alive and not really showing your hand anywhere yet. And that line I knew reasonably well, or at least I thought so, but I had committed a pretty serious sin. After the candidates, I really should have updated my repertoire and had another look at the move a4, be it after the candidates or preparing for this game. Because that's what Caruana did against Svidler. That was out of fashion for a while, and I think it's rightly out of fashion, frankly. But I hadn't repeated it, and it's not a big surprise that if Fabiano Caruana does something, that it's gonna get popular again. This move bishop to d7 is supposed to be the precise reply. Might look strange, but yeah, I've mentioned countless times that the bishop doesn't belong here because it has nothing to do on this diagonal. Bishop g4 looks active, but it's sort of a blank shot here. So bishop d7 and b4 are the main lines, and I always like the move bishop d7. This is also what Svidler did, and after c3, Svidler in that game played castles, and I was doing commentary live, and I criticized him for castles, saying now after bishop c2, which of course was played, black is no longer in time to get his knight a5 c5 plan, so this line is dangerous. And I, of course, decided to put my money where my mouth is and play the critical move, knight a5, which I believe is the correct move, bishop c2, c5. But I haven't repeated these lines for quite a while, and turns out you have to know a bit. d4, queen to b8. I was still in book here, that much I do know. You gotta go queen b8 to cover the e5 pawn, bishop g5. And the reason I'm upset at myself for this game, apart from the fact that I lost, is that I played the move h6, which I knew was playable and the main move and had been played before, but I knew nothing about the complications that ensued, or couldn't remember anything. And I also knew that if you want to avoid those, you can play the move bishop e6 with a very reasonable position. Black isn't that worried about running into d5 and going back, because with white having played a4, there tends to be enough counterplay on the queen side here, with the bishop committed to g5. d5 is not that attractive, I would say, so I'm not saying this line is winning for black or anything, but bishop e6 leads to a perfectly playable position. And with my lack of knowledge or recollection here, I should certainly have done that. Because over the board, when I played h6, I saw he could take here. I knew there were some games with bishop h4, now bishop e6, which is arguably a slightly better version. Even though it's arguable. I'm not even sure it is a better version. But there is the option bishop f6, which I saw over the board, but couldn't recall anything. All I knew is that this is not supposed to be critical and the computer doesn't like it for white. But after queen d5, I had to solve some very concrete problems. The pawn on c5 is under attack. I'm undeveloped and black has to sacrifice a pawn more or less. And I wasn't up for the task. I spent a lot of time calculating the move knight b7 here, which I didn't like, and rightly so. This was actually played in an earlier game, as I learned afterwards, by Caruana, but knight b7 is not good. I played the best move, the move queen to c8, covering c5 and giving up the e5 pawn. But after knight takes e5, bishop e6, queen d6, this is more or less forced. I failed to find the correct move, and yeah, if you don't know such stuff, you either have to be very good over the board, or you have to play quite a move, like bishop e6 instead of h6. Here, the only move that black has, which gives them full compensation, is the very strange move b4. The point is, if white takes this, then black is in time to go knight to b7. And it turns out that after queen c6, knight c6, bishop b2, this open diagonal is very, very favorable for black all of a sudden. Therefore, cb4 is not really a move. And it turns out that it's surprisingly hard for white to get fully mobilized here. It's a very strange position because Yeah, there's many tactical options. The best seems to be f4 for white, bishop takes e5, queen takes e5, short castles. And even though black is a whole pawn down, it's still very, very difficult for white to keep control. b3 in the air, knight c4 in the air. And the computer laughs at all this and says that black is fine. But the move b4 over the board was above my powers, and it's a very unnatural move. I'm not so mad at myself for not finding it. I'm mainly mad at myself for going h6 without, rechecking these complications or deciding, you know what, it's not worth it, let's play bishop e6. So instead of b4, I went for bishop e7, which is the second best move, but it's second best by quite a margin. And after queen to d1, black just doesn't get enough compensation for his missing pawn here. I do have the two bishops, but it really is not enough. White just develops knight bd2, queen e2, and after e5 my king will always be weak. And I lost more or less, not without a fight maybe, but I didn't really have a feeling I was ever getting back into the game. And Khairuli played a very good game and beat me convincingly. That was sort of my Bangkok Open Groundhog Day, because the year before I also had 6 out of 7, was in the lead, and then I lost to Wang Hao. And if you lose round number 8 with 9 rounds to go, normally it's very hard to come back in a Swiss, because a lot of the other guys will have beaten weaker opponents. And indeed, with 6 out of 8, I was kind of out of the race for first place, because there were too many guys on 6.5, so I could still hope I would win the last round. They would all draw, but that didn't quite happen. Good news for me is that I did win the last round indeed against Anton Smirnov. By the way, in case you're confused why this engine bar has been frozen or showing the same thing forever, I'm confused too. Looks like the engine is frozen and doesn't show me any lines, so ignore the bar for most of the video, but just trust my expert advice instead. So last round, it turns out I was getting the same opening every game. I played against Anton Smirnov, who has 2 openings, the Slav and the Grunfeld. Against the Grunfeld, I never know what to do, but I have some ideas in some of the anti-Grunfelds after knight f3, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, be it queen a4 check, or cd5, followed by queen a4 or queen b3. I've played all these lines, and I do know my way around very well. I think the chances for an advantage are better there than in the normal Grunfeld. So that was one big reason for me to start with knight f3, not with d4. And I'd noticed that he had some games with the pure Slav, let's say. So I thought if I go d4, knight f6, c4, c6, knight c3, then he would probably take on c4, which somehow I wasn't particularly eager to discuss. Nothing wrong with it, and I've had many games here with white after a4. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to try to move order him into the semi-Slav, which I had already into previous games. And I thought that maybe it would not be Anton's specialty. And therefore I played the move c4. The problem with c4 is that black has 2 very decent moves in d4 and d takes c4. But normally Slav players, since it would be extra work to learn one of those, they go for the move c6. And here is the point of my move order trickery. Now you go e3, knight f6, and knight c3. And once again, this is a little different from your standard Slav, where if white goes e3 here, the pawn is on d4, but the knight is on c3 yet. Here black's main lines are bishop f5 or bishop g4, developing this bishop, which are both very playable. But after knight c3, developing this bishop is not so easy. For example, bishop f5, I do have cd, cd, and queen b3, which is very, very awkward to mate now that the knight is already on c3, attacking the d5 pawn. So black should probably not do that. Bishop g4. There's also some questions white can ask after c takes d5. I believe white is a little better here as well. So instead, black's best move, in my opinion, is the move e6, which Smirnov played. But I thought I had expertly tricked him into the semi-Slav and out of the Slav. Turns out though, as he told me after the game, that he had prepared the semi-Slav all along and he was quite happy with his development. So my devious plan didn't really work. But anyway, after knight bd7, I thought, okay, queen c2 got me nowhere, and let's discuss main lines. Let's play bishop d3, dc, bishop c4, b5, bishop d3. He had never had this position, or at least in my base he hadn't, so I wasn't sure if he was gonna go for bishop b7, for a6, or for bishop d6. All of these are branches with a lot of theory, even though bishop d6 and bishop b7 can often transpose into each other. He went for bishop d6, castle, castle, and I decided to transpose. Well, I think this is the main line, so it's not really a transposition, but to go for the line with queen c2, which more often than not you get via this move order, which I mentioned in my game against Luke. This is the same position. So we got this on the board, queen c2, bishop b7, and the move a3. This is a line, yeah, that has been played for a long, long time now. It's one of the big tabias out there. a3, stopping black from going b4, and also preparing b4 yourself to sort of make this bishop look silly. Lots of theory here. I've played a6 myself, queen e7 has been played, h6, but the trendy move is the one that Smirnov blitzed out. When he blitzed that out, I already had the feeling that my opening trickery might not really have borne any fruit, and that he was well prepared, which it turned out he was. Rook to c8. This move was considered sort of silly for a long time because white can go b4, apparently stopping c5. But then people found out that you can't push c5 here anyway. However, the next evolution is that Giri, who knows everything about everything, recently didn't go c5 in this position, but played a5 and equalized against Sergei Karyakin. So since Giri hadn't played it, I thought maybe there's something wrong with b4, c5. I'd analyze this position, but frankly, I hadn't found anything too wrong. So I knew quite a bit, but it turns out Smirnov knew at least as much as me about this, which is not ideal since I really was trying to get him out of book. Didn't work, and therefore I had to work over the board, which is, well, you always have to do that. But it's an unpleasant feeling if you're trying to outsmart your opponent, then he blitzes out everything. c5 is a weird move. It looks like it's just losing after bc5. But the one big point is that after bishop f3, if white recaptures gf3, turns out that black isn't time to go. Knight takes c5, d takes c5, rook takes c5. White has nothing better than pretty much agreeing to a draw here. The best move is f4, and then black isn't time to go. Knight d5, bishop d2. Takes queen c7, followed by rook to c8, and win the piece back on c3. Theory continues a bit, but this line is nothing at all for white. I knew that, and I knew that nowadays a battleground is the move c takes d6 instead of g takes f3. When, yeah, if black were to retreat, of course white would still have a fantastic position, a pawn up, two bishops and so on. So black pretty much has to go knight to d5. Attacking the knight on c3 and also preparing to go queen to g5. Best move is g takes f3, and here Smirnov, who, as I said, was very well prepared for this game, kept blitzing. He blitzed out the move queen g5 check, which I'm not sure has been played before. It's in my files as well, so this wasn't a surprise, but still, it mainly annoyed me that he knew everything. There's one game, Shirov, I believe, Shirov with black against Wojtaszek, where Wojtaszek won a nice game after knight takes c3, which is a worse move. Now white goes f4, and after knight f6, queen to b2. White has, in my opinion, very, very decent chances for an opening advantage, and Wojtaszek won that game very convincingly. So I was happy to play that line, but I was also aware that queen g5 is a good move. And you have to do some work for that, because the computer after king h1, queen h5, this is the idea, before taking the piece, hitting the f3 pawn. At first he gives a big, big advantage for white here after bishop takes h7 check. So I thought this might be stuff, since I'm a bit of an expert in all this stuff that Smirnov would not be aware of, but it turns out I was wrong. The problem is bishop h7 is not very good, even though the computer gets excited about it at first. Black has to go king h8. If he goes queen h7, then you take and you get more or less winning endgame, so that's not ideal. But after king h8, the point is now the computer gives bishop e4, defending f3 after having grabbed this pawn, and he's very excited about his chances. But if you dig a little deeper, it turns out that white actually has nothing. Knight takes c3, bishop d2. This is the computer line. The computer gives f5 here, when white is in fact better after bishop takes c3, fe, rook g1. Sorry for this long excursus, but I just want to show off my theory knowledge, which still wasn't enough in this game. The problem is there is this move knight to f6, which is all in my files as well. As I said, I play this line with both colors. I've analyzed it quite a bit, but I still didn't know what to do. And the lines after knight f6, at first the computer thinks white is more or less winning here, but then he changes his mind. Point is queen c3, knight e4, takes, and it's perpetual. So instead you have to keep the queen in contact with the bishop on e4. Go queen b1, but it turns out that black is in time to generate counterplay as well here. Rook b3 is the key move. Queen b3, knight e4. Once again, there's nothing more than a draw. And if the queen goes to d1 now to keep an eye on the f3 pawn, then black goes rook b2. And if you let the computer of your choice run for a little bit in this position, it will start blinking 0, 0, 0. Black is just too active. There's nothing you can do to avoid the draw here. There's still ideas like rook d2 sometimes, and there's just nothing to do. So my problem was I knew all that, but I didn't really know how to fight for an advantage. Like, I knew that bishop e2 was a better try, but it also doesn't really lead to anything. And it turns out that my opponent was just extremely well prepared and equalized with the black pieces, which is what happens, but normally that's why I use all this move order cunning and opening sneakiness to avoid such things. And for the second time in a row, Luke van Vele surprised me with his e5 move, and I got absolutely nothing. Here, Smirnov just blitzed out all the critical move in this very sharp line. I got nothing. Still, it's a fascinating position. After knight takes c3, rook g1, it looks weird. White is a pawn up, but the d6 pawn probably won't survive. White has the two bishops, black can take here. And the question is, can white coordinate before black can do any harm to him? Rook g1, Smirnov still blitzed. He played rook fd8. I went e4. These moves are correct, but they cost me a lot of time. I was like down to... I spent a lot of time on my next move as well. But after I played bishop e3 here, I was down to 20 minutes more or less, which is not ideal. Since, yeah, I knew a lot, but not enough. Or, well, maybe it was enough, but there's not enough to get done in this line. So anyway, rook g1, rook fd8, e4. White is threatening to go e5 or bishop f4 or even rook g5, whatever. So e5 is pretty much forced. And it turns out that black is well enough coordinated to get his pawn back. Knight f6 next. That, yeah, it's hard to get an advantage here. I spent all my time on bishop g5 instead of bishop e3, which if black had to go f6, bishop e3, then this inclusion, I believe, favors white. And I would have been quite happy. But I was trying to figure out what's going on in this position. And in the end I decided, and I believe rightly so, that black just has too much compensation here. This knight is super active. My light square bishop looks pretty dumb. The pawn on d6 will probably fall after knight e5 or queen e5 get picked up. And my pieces really didn't look very convincing. I believe the computer gives equality here as well, but it just felt like a bad practical choice. So I went bishop e3 instead, which is a more natural move, just covering d4. But the problem is after bishop e3, black can simplify the game and get his pawn back pretty much by force. Knight e2, queen e2, ed, bishop d4. At least these moves are easy to make, so the time trouble didn't bother me so much. Or it's not really time trouble, but 20 minutes is not that much to get to move 40. Knight e5, and I can't really keep my extra pawn. I'd seen all this while I was mentally whining about my options, and I decided that I should go queen e3 here. And here, well, Smirnov was out of book by now as well, and fortunately for me, he committed a pretty serious mistake. He went rook takes d6, and after rook g5, white gets a very pleasant endgame. The line is forced, queen f3, knight f3, rook g7. I'd calculated all this if king h8, bishop b2, and white is better because you can always escape here. While if king f8, as in the game, rook h7, threatening rook h8 check, and white just emerges a pawn up and I managed to win that endgame. Not exactly convincingly, but still without too much trouble. Now, theoretically speaking, the problem is that instead of rook takes d6, black should play the move g6, just taking a timeout to secure his g7 square, and white has absolutely nothing. Over the board I was intending to go rook g5 here, but a closer look reveals that in this position, this is the line I wanted to play after knight d4, rook d4. Black just goes f6, king f7, king e6, and my passed pawns aren't dangerous at all. So it's pretty much nothing. And it's not surprising, like black played well, the line holds. There is just not much there. It was a pretty good game up to this point, even though I wish my preparation would have been better. But there's just nothing there. Queen e5, queen a7 is another line that's playable, but after rook d6, it's fairly obvious that black has full compensation for the missing pawn. The game should end peacefully. So I dodged a bullet there and won the game against Anton Smirnov, by the way. I haven't talked about him. Another extremely talented teenager. I had the feeling I was playing teenagers every other game in this tournament. Let's see, I think I have a picture. Yeah, here we go. This is how things normally looked for me in the Thailand Open. I really am an old man nowadays, playing against the next generation. Look at the guy, 2-4-79, and he's been good for a while. Big chess hope from Australia. And yeah, I was lucky to win that game, or happy to win that game. Lucky maybe is a stretch. And make it to 7 out of 9, but that was half a point short of the two co-winners, Paco Vallejo and Surya Ganguly, who won the tournament on tiebreak. Both with big last round wins, Ganguly against Van Vele and Vallejo against Nigel Short, who both played a much better tournament than me, so I can't really whine about missing any chances. But yeah, I was left with a slightly annoyed feeling that once again in round 8 I get a decent opponent with black and I just get crushed. That has to change. Still, 7 out of 9, didn't lose any rating with considering all the kids I played. I don't think is a terrible result, but opening wise things didn't go very well. Like, yeah, I got nothing against Luke with white, I lost more or less out of the opening against Khairulin, and I got nothing against Smirnov. All the other guys I outrated by quite a margin, so not much to brag about there. Which means, yeah, either start playing better, or work harder, or just become more flexible. I think that has been my main problem. With white I was disputing this semi-Slav line pretty much every day, even though I did make changes. I got this in 3 games in a row, which is a bit strange. Yeah, normally that doesn't happen. And with black, yeah, my repertoire is a bit limited, which means you either have to know it really well, which I thought I did, but I was caught off guard there, or you just have to be more flexible and play more different stuff. So overall, a lot of, yeah, stuff to work on. Then again, this is the only tournament I play per year, and let's see how well prepared I am for the next one. I can highly recommend it to anybody. It's a fantastic open tournament, the Bangkok Open in Thailand. So if you don't have plans yet for next April 2017, I very much recommend giving that tournament a look. I even wore my Bangkok t-shirt to plug it. Anyway, I hope this video was interesting for you guys. I'm not so sure, it felt like I was rambling and whining a lot, but that's what I do. Thanks for watching anyway, and see you next time. Bye bye.